James Carter steered the moving truck carefully along the tree-lined streets of estates, glancing at the rows of neatly trimmed lawns and perfectly painted shutters. Everything about the neighborhood looked peaceful, almost picture-perfect, which was exactly why he and his wife had chosen it. After years of moving from place to place during military service, they wanted stability. They wanted a home. Sat beside him in the passenger seat, her hand resting gently on the edge of the window as she looked at the houses they passed. Beside her, in the backseat of their smaller SUV following close behind, were Rex and Shadow. Rex, the German shepherd, was steady and calm, always alert but never restless. Shadow, the Belgian, was leaner and quicker, his sharp eyes constantly moving as if assessing everything in his path. They weren't just dogs. They were partners she had trained and trusted during her years as a K9 handler. "This looks like the kind of place where people wave at their neighbors," James said with a grin. Gave a small smile. "Let's hope so. Rex and Shadow might need a little time to adjust to so many new sights and smells." When they pulled into the driveway of their new home, stepped out and stretched. The two K9s leapt out behind her, moving with fluid precision, their training visible even in casual moments. Clipped their leashes and led them to the yard, letting them sniff the grass while the movers began unloading boxes. The first neighbor appeared almost immediately. A tall woman in a pale sweater walked briskly down the sidewalk, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She introduced herself as the president of the Homeowners Association. Her smile was polite but tight, her eyes drifting to Rex and Shadow as if measuring every movement they made. "Welcome to Estates," she said. "We value order and harmony here. I do hope your dogs are well behaved." "They're very well trained," replied calmly. "They're former service K9s. Discipline is part of their nature." Smile tightened further. "Well, we'll see how they do. We like to keep everything predictable here." She gave a small nod, as though making a mental note, before walking away. James exhaled once she was out of earshot. "That was warm and friendly," he muttered under his breath. Simply stroked Shadow's head. She had seen that look before, doubt mixed with judgment. Still, she didn't want to start their new chapter with unease. She told herself it was nothing. As the afternoon went on, other neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves. Some were genuinely kind, bringing small welcome gifts like cookies or flowers. Most asked about Rex and Shadow and explained their background, how they had worked beside her, trained for discipline, and saved lives in ways most people couldn't imagine. A few neighbors were impressed, even fascinated. Others kept their distance. By evening, the Carters were sitting on their front porch, sipping iced tea and watching the last of the moving boxes disappear inside. Rex and Shadow lay at their feet, calm but vigilant, ears twitching at every sound. Fireflies danced over the lawns, and for a moment everything felt peaceful. "This is what we wanted," James said softly. "A place to breathe." Nodded. "I just hope the dogs can be accepted here. They deserve that much." Later that night, as they settled into their new bedroom, heard Rex give a low rumble from his place near the window. It wasn't a full bark, just a warning sound. Shadow joined him, his body stiff, eyes fixed on the shadows near the street. Rose quietly and looked out through the curtain. She saw nothing more than a figure walking briskly past, perhaps just a late-night jogger. Still, she knew the dogs didn't react without reason. She placed a calming hand on Rex's back. "It's all right, boy," she whispered. Yet in her heart, she wondered if the first day had already given her a glimpse of challenges ahead. For now, though, she chose peace. She whispered to James that everything was fine, curled under the covers, and listened to the steady breathing of her husband and her dogs. The night stretched quietly around them, but instincts reminded her of something she had always trusted during her service years. Sometimes, still waters hid deeper currents. And Estates, with its perfect lawns and smiling neighbors, might not be as simple as it first appeared. The morning sun spilled across Estates, painting the rows of houses in a golden glow. James brewed coffee in the kitchen while let Rex and Shadow stretch their legs in the fenced backyard. The dogs ran a few laps, their energy sharp and controlled, before returning to sit near her side. They were disciplined, never barking without cause, never charging at the fence. They were the very image of obedience. When James returned from the mailbox with the day's letters, he frowned. "We've already got something from the HOA. he said, handing her a thin envelope. Raised her brows. That was fast. She opened it and read silently. The notice claimed their dogs had been barking excessively, disturbing the peace of the neighborhood, blinked, almost laughing at the absurdity. The dogs had barely made a sound since they'd arrived. James shook his head. They didn't even give us a week. Folded the letter neatly. It's nothing we can't handle, maybe it was a mistake. But deep down, she remembered's careful smile and the way her eyes had narrowed on Rex and Shadow. It didn't feel like a mistake. Later that day, as walked the dogs along the sidewalk, she noticed two HOA members she recognized from the welcome meeting standing a few houses away. They weren't greeting her. Instead, one held a clipboard, scribbling while the other pointed toward Rex and Shadow. Kept her stride calm, ignoring the watchful stares, but her gut tightened. By evening, another envelope appeared on their porch. This time, the complaint was about leash laws, though always kept Rex and Shadow clipped securely by her side. The notes were polite on the surface but sharp underneath, like a velvet glove hiding a fist. James tried to lighten the mood as they unpacked boxes in the living room. I bet they just like paperwork. Some people need a hobby. Gave him a thin smile but didn't respond. She had spent years learning to read subtle warnings in unpredictable places. She knew when something wasn't random. This wasn't about barking or leashes. It was about them. That night after James had gone to bed, stayed up reading in the living room. Rex lay at her feet while Shadow rested near the back door. Both dogs suddenly lifted their heads, ears pricked. A low growl rose from Rex's throat, set her book aside instantly. She moved quietly to the window and peered out into the backyard. The motion sensor light had clicked on, but the space looked empty. Still, Shadow stood stiff, his gaze locked on the far corner of the fence as if tracking movement just beyond sight. Stepped outside onto the porch. The night air was cool, the grass glistening faintly with dew. She scanned the yard, every sense alert. Nothing stirred, yet the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Slowly, she walked back inside, closing the door behind her. She knelt beside her dogs, pressing her hands gently to their shoulders. "Good watch," she whispered. Both dogs relaxed, but she knew their instincts were rarely wrong. Someone had been there. The next morning, another violation notice appeared, slipped under the door. This one listed improper lawn maintenance, even though their grass had been mowed by professionals only days before. James read it aloud in disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "They're inventing reasons." Tucked the notice into a folder she had started. "Then we'll keep every letter. If this continues, we'll have a record." James studied her face. "You really think this is intentional?" Looked out at Rex and Shadow resting in the sunlit yard. "I know it is, and if they're going this far, it's only the beginning." The day rolled on, filled with unpacking and small errands, yet couldn't shake the feeling of invisible eyes watching. She caught glimpses of walking her rounds with that ever-present clipboard, pausing near their house just a moment too long. Neighbors' curtains shifted as if people were peeking out only to vanish when she looked back. As the sun set, she sat with James on the porch again, sipping tea while Rex and Shadow lounged nearby. Everything looked peaceful, almost serene. But the folder of notices inside told another story, one of unwelcome beginnings, whispered doubts, and subtle hostility. Leaned back in her chair, the cool evening breeze brushing across her face. She had faced tougher opponents in harsher places, yet she also knew that battles weren't always fought with force. Some were fought with patience, with evidence, and with a quiet resilience that others underestimated. She reached down, her hand resting on Rex's strong shoulders, his head lifted, eyes steady on hers. "We'll handle it," she murmured, and though she spoke softly, the weight behind her words carried the same certainty that had guided her through years of service. Estates might believe it was just another neighborhood squabble, but Carter knew better. The quiet surface was starting to crack, and what lay beneath was far from ordinary. The following week began with a rhythm that should have felt ordinary. James headed off to work, leaving to continue unpacking, arranging the house, and establishing a routine with Rex and Shadow. Yet the sense of calm she had hoped for never fully settled. Each morning seemed to bring a new envelope tucked into the mailbox or slipped beneath their door. The third letter accused them of unsightly trash bins left in view, blinked at the claim as she stared at their perfectly stored containers, tucked neatly inside the garage. The fourth letter mentioned yard clutter, though they owned nothing more than a pair of garden chairs and a bird feeder. When James came home and read the letters, his frustration bubbled over. They're inventing problems out of thin air. This is harassment, plain and simple. Didn't disagree, but she remained measured. She slipped the notices into the growing folder, her methodical side taking control. Every note they send just adds to the record, she said. The more they exaggerate, the easier it will be to show the truth. Still, she couldn't ignore the way neighbors had begun acting differently. At first, they had stopped by with cookies or small greetings. Now, many simply nodded stiffly or hurried inside when she passed with Rex and Shadow. Some whispered in hushed tones behind fences or driveways, their glances drifting to the dogs. One afternoon, as she guided Rex and Shadow along the sidewalk, she caught sight of standing across the street with 3 HOA members at her side. They weren't making conversation. They were watching. One held a clipboard, another a phone raised as if snapping pictures, gave a polite nod and continued on, ignoring the tightness in her chest. That evening, James noticed her unease. "You're quiet," he said as they sat at the dining table. "I've dealt with stares before," replied softly. "But these aren't curious glances. They're looking for something to use against us." To release the tension, she brought Rex and Shadow into the yard for a training session. Under the soft glow of the setting sun, she issued commands and the dogs moved with precision. Sit, stay, heel, circle, down. Their discipline was flawless, each movement sharp and exact. A small group of children watched from a nearby lawn, their eyes wide with admiration. One boy even clapped when Shadow leapt gracefully over a low hurdle had set up. Yet across the street, groups scribbled furiously on clipboards, their faces stiff with disapproval. Later that night, another letter arrived, this one accused of public intimidation tactics, claiming her training sessions were frightening neighbors. James read the words aloud with disbelief. "Intimidation? They're just following your lead. They're models of control." Folded the letter, her expression calm but her mind sharp. To them, obedience looks like a show of force. They want to twist everything. The pressure grew in small but constant ways. Anonymous notes appeared on their porch with vague messages like, "Some animals don't belong here," or "Keep the peace." Each was unsigned, written in neat block letters. Showed them to James but didn't react outwardly. Inside, though, she recognized the tactic, pressure by isolation. Make someone feel unwanted until they leave. One evening, as the couple enjoyed dinner on the porch, Rex's head lifted suddenly. He stared across the street, muscles taut. Shadow mirrored him, his ears sharp and his body rigid. Followed their gaze. For a split second, she saw the glint of something reflective near a hedge, perhaps binoculars, perhaps a camera, before it disappeared. She whispered to James, "They're documenting us." "Why?" James asked, his voice heavy. "Because they want to build a case, even if it's not true." That night sat at her desk and opened a blank notebook. She began her own log, writing down dates, times, and details of every notice, every suspicious glance, every strange occurrence. The military had taught her one thing above all: documentation mattered. If battles were fought in silence, evidence was the weapon. As she wrote, Rex curled at her feet, Shadow watching from the corner of the room. Their presence steadied her as it always had. They were more than protectors, they were reminders of resilience. Looking out the window at the perfectly quiet street, knew the days ahead would bring more pressure. The HOA wasn't finished. Their campaign had only begun, and though estates appeared peaceful on the surface, she sensed a storm was gathering beneath the polished lawns and white fences. She set down her pen and stroked Rex's head. "We're ready," she whispered. The dogs looked back at her with unwavering loyalty, and in that moment understood something clearly. The HOA thought they were pressing against weakness, but what they didn't realize was that discipline, patience, and strength could hold longer than any storm. The next homeowners association meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the community hall at the edge of estates. James suggested they skip it, but insisted on going. "If they're going to keep targeting us, we should face it directly," she said, sliding the folder of notices into her bag. "Better to speak up than stay silent." The hall was already crowded when they arrived. Rows of folding chairs faced a small stage where a long table had been set up for the board. Sat in the center, clipboard in hand, flanked by two other board members. Her expression was calm but firm, like someone already convinced of her position. Neighbors filled the chairs, their conversations hushed but expectant. Some greeted James and politely, while others avoided eye contact. A few children whispered excitedly about Rex and Shadow, who were resting at home this time. When the meeting began, moved quickly through minor neighborhood issues, trash collection schedules, parking space disputes, and a new proposal for a community garden. Then her tone shifted, and her gaze settled directly on. "There is a matter of concern that requires our attention," announced. "Several residents have expressed unease regarding two large dogs that were recently brought into our neighborhood." Murmurs rippled through the room. James sat, his jaw tight, but kept her composure. Continued, "We've received multiple reports of excessive noise, intimidating behavior, and unsafe displays of training exercises. While we respect the role pets can play in households, Estates prides itself on being a calm, family-friendly environment." Stood slowly. Her presence was calm, steady. "With respect," she said, "the reports you've received are inaccurate. My dogs are trained service animals. They've been with me for years, and they're disciplined beyond what most pets are capable of. They don't bark without cause, they don't wander, and the training you've seen is structured obedience, not aggression." His brows lifted slightly. "Service animals." "Yes," confirmed. "I served as a military K9 handler. Rex and Shadow are not just pets, they're trained partners. They've protected lives and followed commands under the most demanding conditions. They are loyal, disciplined, and safe." There was a pause. Some neighbors shifted in their seats, clearly surprised by this information. A few even looked impressed, but expression hardened. "This is not the military, Mrs. Carter. We have community standards here. What may seem orderly to you can appear intimidating to others." James spoke up then, his voice controlled but firm. "With all due respect, intimidation is about intent. Training sessions are nothing more than her exercising her dogs. If children stop to watch, it's because they're amazed, not afraid." A man in the audience raised his hand. "My son actually thinks the dogs are incredible," he said. "He talks about them all the time. He says they're like superheroes." Another woman added softly, "I've walked past them. They're calmer than most of the small dogs in this neighborhood." The murmurs grew louder. Support for was emerging, but tapped her clipboard sharply, regaining order. "Regardless, perception matters. If some residents feel uncomfortable, the board has a duty to address it." Lifted the folder from her bag. "Then I'd like to submit a record. Every notice we've received so far. Each one is documented here, along with dates and the conditions at the time. None of them reflect the reality of our home. I encourage the board to review them carefully before drawing conclusions." She placed the folder on the table. The gesture was simple, but it carried weight. Several neighbors leaned forward, curious. Glanced at the folder but didn't touch it. Instead, she said, "We'll take your notes into consideration, but I suggest you remember that harmony in this community depends on cooperation." The meeting moved on to other topics, but the tension lingered. When it finally ended, neighbors filed out in clusters. Some stopped to offer quiet words of support to and James. Others remained silent, but their expressions were less certain than before. Outside, under the soft glow of the streetlights, James let out a slow breath. "You handled that perfectly," he said. Walked beside him, her face calm, though her heart still carried the weight of the confrontation. "It's only the beginning," she replied. "But at least now they know we're not afraid to stand up." At home, Rex and Shadow greeted them eagerly, their tails wagging as if they sensed the shift in energy. Knelt to hug them both, pressing her forehead against Rex's fur. "We'll keep moving forward," she whispered. "Together." The confrontation had not ended the tension. If anything, it had drawn clearer lines. Yet as stroked the steady warmth of her companions, she felt the same quiet certainty she had carried into the hall. They were ready for whatever came next. The weekend began quietly enough. The Carters spent the morning arranging and hanging pictures, finally making the house feel more like a home. Took Rex and Shadow for a long walk around the neighborhood, keeping them close at her side. The dogs walked with perfect discipline, their movements a mirror of her commands. A few children waved from their yards, but the parents quickly ushered them inside. Noticed, but she kept her chin high. That afternoon, as James trimmed a few hedges, he spotted a folded piece of paper wedged into the front gate. He handed it to with a frown. The note read in block letters, "Get rid of the animals before someone gets hurt." Studied the words, her face unreadable. She folded the note carefully and placed it into her growing folder of evidence. "This isn't just paperwork anymore," she said quietly. "It's intimidation." James wanted to call the police immediately, but shook her head. "Not yet. Without proof of who wrote it, it won't go far. We need to be patient." That night, a new problem appeared. Bright red spray paint marked their side fence with a single word, "Dangerous." James scrubbed at it furiously while documented everything with her phone. The paint came off eventually, but the message remained in their minds. The next morning installed small cameras along the perimeter of the house. She explained to James, "These aren't just for us. They'll protect the dogs, too. If anyone tries to provoke them, we'll have proof of what really happened." Days passed, but the sense of unease only grew. Began to notice patterns. Whenever she walked, the dogs seemed to appear nearby, either standing at a corner or speaking with a group of neighbors who fell silent when approached. Clipboards and phones were common accessories, and whispers followed her steps. One evening, as the sun dipped low, stood in the yard with Rex and Shadow. The dogs stiffened suddenly, their heads turning toward the far end of the fence. Rex gave a low growl and Shadow stood tall, ears pointed forward, followed their gaze but saw nothing. Still, she trusted their instincts. Someone was there, watching. The next morning, another anonymous note appeared, this one more pointed. "Leave now. This neighborhood doesn't want you or your animals." James slammed the note down on the kitchen counter. "This is going too far. We're not living like this." Placed a hand on his arm. "I know, but if we react without evidence, they'll twist it against us. We stay calm, we gather everything, and when the time comes, we'll show the truth." Later that day, she took Rex and Shadow through another round of training in the backyard. Their obedience was flawless. Sit, heel, down, guard. Shadow moved like a shadow, quick and precise, while Rex remained steady and strong. Felt grounded as she worked with them, her voice calm, her movements smooth. What she didn't know was that 2 HOA members were standing just beyond the street corner, phones raised to record snippets of the session. She noticed only when Rex lifted his head sharply, his eyes locking onto the motion, turned in time to catch the figures ducking away. That evening, another official letter arrived. This one accused her of encouraging aggressive displays that made the neighborhood unsafe for children. James read it aloud in disbelief. "Aggressive? They sat when you told them to. They healed perfectly." Slipped the letter into the folder with the others. "They're trying to build a narrative," she said softly, "but all they're really building is a trail of evidence that shows their intent." As the week closed, the Carters sat together on the porch. The night was cool, the crickets singing faintly in the background. Rex lay at its feet, Shadow stretched beside him, both of them calm yet alert. James looked at his wife. "How long do you think this will go on?" Stroked Rex's fur, her voice quiet but steady. "As long as it takes, but they don't understand something important. Intimidation only works if you let it, and I've faced worse than notes and spray paint." She leaned back, eyes fixed on the peaceful-looking street. Somewhere in the distance, a curtain shifted as if someone was watching. Didn't flinch. Her calm composure wasn't just for herself. It was for James, for Rex and Shadow, and for the home they had chosen together. The pressure was building, the tactics growing bolder. Yet's resolve remained unshaken. For every attempt to push them out, she became more certain. They belonged here, and no campaign of whispers or warnings would change that. By now, the Carters' folder of notices and anonymous letters had grown thick. What had begun as simple accusations about barking and lawn care had evolved into direct threats, graffiti and shadowy figures near their fence at night. Had documented it all, photos, dates, and now, hours of recorded video from the cameras she had installed around the property. Still, she could feel the pressure tightening. Each day felt heavier, as though the weight of suspicion pressed against their home from all sides. One Friday evening, James came home later than usual, was in the backyard running Rex and Shadow through evening drills. Both dogs moved in perfect formation under her crisp commands, responding instantly to every word. To anyone watching, it was a display of loyalty and control. To, it was simply routine, a way to keep them sharp, grounded, and calm. When James joined her, he handed over the mail. Another notice, this one accusing them of creating disturbances during late-night hours. Tucked it into the folder without a word. "Do you ever think about leaving?" James asked quietly, watching her expression. Shook her head. "Leaving would mean giving in, and these dogs, this home, our life, we've earned them, we won't run." That night after dinner, sat in the living room while James dozed off in his chair. Rex and Shadow lay at her feet, relaxed but alert. The hum of the night was steady until Rex's head shot up. A deep rumble filled his chest. Shadow followed, ears stiff, his body low to the ground. Froze, listening. The motion lights in the backyard flicked on, casting harsh beams across the grass. Her heart raced, not in fear but in readiness. She moved quickly to the back door and peered out. A figure was inside the yard. The man wore dark clothing, his hood pulled tight, a phone in his hand. He seemed startled by the sudden light, fumbling as he tried to snap pictures of Rex and Shadow through the fence. But when he turned, he realized too late that he wasn't alone. "Open the door. Stop right there." Her voice was calm but commanding, the same tone she had used countless times in the field. The man froze, but only for a moment. Then he bolted toward the side gate. Before he could reach it, gave a single, sharp command. "Guard." Rex and Shadow sprang into action. They didn't bite. They didn't tackle. Instead, they fanned out, one circling left, the other right, cutting off the man's path. Their movements were swift and precise, their bodies creating an unbreakable wall of control. The intruder spun, panicked, trying to find an escape. But wherever he turned, Rex and Shadow adjusted, herding him into the open space of the yard. Stepped forward, her voice steady. "You're not going anywhere until the police arrive." The man's breathing grew ragged. "Call them off," he shouted. "They're already controlled," replied. "If you don't move, they won't either, but if you try to run, I can't promise what will happen." James burst out the back door moments later, his phone already in hand. He dialed quickly, reporting the break-in. Within minutes, the sound of sirens cut through the night air. The man stood trapped, unable to escape the silent, steady guardians who flanked him. When officers arrived, they moved carefully into the yard, handcuffing the intruder while Rex and Shadow returned to side at a quiet command. The trespasser turned out to be Harold, a distant relative of who had been seen occasionally at neighborhood events. Under questioning, he admitted that had asked him to collect evidence of the dogs misbehaving, proof that could justify forcing the Carters out. His photos, however, showed nothing more than two disciplined animals obeying their handler. The officers took Harold away, but the damage was done, not to James, but to his campaign. For the first time, there was undeniable proof that the harassment wasn't random, it was orchestrated. When the yard was quiet again, knelt beside Rex and Shadow, stroking their fur. "Good guard," she whispered. Their tails thumped once against the grass, calm now that the threat was gone. James stood nearby, his face pale but resolute. "They could have been hurt," he said softly. Shook her head. "They knew what to do, they always do." The breaking point had arrived, but instead of shattering, felt stronger than ever. The attempt to intimidate her had only revealed the truth, and Estates would never look its leadership the same way again. The morning after the break-in, Estates hummed with whispers. News of Harold's arrest traveled faster than anyone could have expected. By sunrise, neighbors were already stopping on the sidewalks, pretending to water their lawns or retrieve the morning paper just to get a glimpse of the Carter house. stepped outside with Rex and Shadow at her side. The dogs walked calmly, their presence steady but commanding. She waved to a neighbor who lingered across the street, and though the woman quickly looked away, could sense the shift. Something had cracked in the smooth surface of the HOA's authority. James emerged behind her carrying a mug of coffee. "They're talking already," he said under his breath. "By noon, the whole neighborhood will know what happened." Nodded. "Good. It's time they see the truth for themselves." Later that afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was announced. Called it herself, determined to regain control of the narrative. The notice claimed it was to address recent disturbances and clarify misinformation, but knew the tactic well: control the stage and you control the story. When they arrived at the clubhouse, the room was already full. Neighbors filled every chair and others stood in the back. Murmurs died down as took her place at the podium, her posture as stiff and formal as ever. "Residents," she began, "it has come to our attention that certain rumors have been circulating regarding recent events. I assure you that the HOA has only ever acted in the best interest of this community. However, actions taken by some have created unnecessary tension, and last night's incident was..." Rose from her seat before could finish. "With all due respect, that incident was a break-in, a crime, and it was carried out by someone acting under your direction." A ripple of gasps moved through the crowd, stiffened. "That is an outrageous accusation." Didn't flinch. "The man admitted it, in front of the police. He said you asked him to collect evidence against us, but what he did was trespass on private property. My cameras recorded everything. Would you like me to share the footage with everyone here?" The room buzzed with murmurs. Several neighbors leaned forward, eyes sharp with curiosity. Others exchanged uneasy looks. For the first time, looked unsettled. James stood next to, his voice steady. "We moved here to be part of this community, not to be singled out and harassed. My wife and I have done nothing wrong. Our dogs are disciplined, trained, and well-behaved. But the HOA leadership has turned them into a target, and last night could have ended very differently." From the back of the room, a voice called out, "Is that true? Did you send him?" Lips tightened. This association has always upheld standards. If people feel those standards are too high, perhaps they don't belong in estates. It was the wrong thing to say. The room erupted in murmurs of disapproval. Some residents frowned, others shook their heads outright. A man near the front stood. "Standards don't mean breaking into someone's yard, that's crossing a line." Another woman chimed in. "I've had enough of the constant notices. My son parked his car slightly over the curb last week and I got fined. Maybe this isn't just about the Carters." Let the moment carry itself. She didn't need to push further. The crowd was already beginning to see what she and James had known for months, that the HOA wasn't protecting the community, but controlling it. By the end of the meeting, managed to adjourn with what little authority she could still wield. But as neighbors filed out, many stopped to speak with and James. Some offered apologies. Others shared their own frustrations. A few even asked to see the video footage. When and James returned home, the sun was setting, casting warm light across the backyard where Rex and Shadow rested. James exhaled heavily, dropping into a chair on the porch. "That might been the turning point," he said. Stroked Shadow's ears, watching as Rex patrolled the fence line out of habit. "It's not over," she replied. "But the truth is out now, and once people see the truth, they can't unsee it." The fallout had begun. The HOA's once unshakable grip on estates was crumbling, piece by piece, under the weight of its own actions, and for the first time in months felt the shift of balance tilt in their favor. The days following the emergency HOA meeting felt different in estates. The air of tension that had lingered for months seemed to thin, replaced by something new: hesitation, questioning, and most of all, change. Neighbors who had once looked the other way now paused to wave at the Carters. A few even stopped at the gate, asking about Rex and Shadow, curious rather than suspicious. Noticed the difference immediately. She still walked the dogs with the same discipline and precision, but now, instead of glares, she caught smiles. Children pressed against the fences to watch as Rex and Shadow followed her crisp commands, tails wagging once the drills ended. The sight of two powerful but controlled animals seemed to shift the narrative entirely. James, too, felt the shift. At work, he caught himself thinking less about the HOA notices and more about the home they had built together. At night, he sat on the porch, the dogs lying close by, finally able to breathe without the constant weight of accusation pressing down on them. But the real turning point came 2 weeks later, when the HOA board called for a special election. The incident with Harold had become impossible to sweep under the rug. Police reports had circulated, neighbors had shared their frustrations, and trust in its leadership had fractured beyond repair. The meeting for the vote was held in the same clubhouse where the fallout had erupted. This time, however, the energy in the room was different. Instead of wary compliance, the atmosphere buzzed with determination. Residents wanted change, and they were ready to take it. Stood at the front, still clinging to her role, but her voice carried less weight than before. She defended her decisions, citing community standards and long-standing traditions, but few seemed moved. When the ballots were counted, the result was decisive. A new president was elected, a soft-spoken man named David who had lived in estates for years but had often stayed in the background. His first words as HOA president set the tone for what was to come. "This neighborhood is more than rules and fines," David said, his voice steady. "It's about people, about families, about respecting one another. We will have standards, yes, but standards must never become weapons." The applause that followed was louder than anything had heard at an HOA meeting before. It was a release, a sign that the community was ready to move forward. Left quietly, her once commanding presence diminished to little more than a shadow slipping out the door. There was no dramatic confrontation, no last word, just silence and the unmistakable sense that her reign had ended. In the weeks that followed, the changes were clear. Notices became rare, reserved for actual issues rather than petty complaints. Neighbors began to gather more often, block parties, shared gardening days, even casual conversations on sidewalks that had once felt tense. For James, the difference was life-changing. No more anonymous letters, no more graffiti, no more fear of retaliation for simply living their lives. One evening, as the sun dipped low, trained Rex and Shadow in the backyard while James grilled dinner on the porch. A group of children gathered near the fence, wide-eyed and excited, smiled, inviting them closer. "Would you like to see what they can do?" she asked. The children nodded eagerly, demonstrated a series of commands: sit, stay, guard, release, and the dogs obeyed with precision. The kids clapped, their laughter carrying into the warm evening air. James watched with pride. "You know," he said when the children finally scampered off, "those dogs changed everything." Shook her head, resting her hand on Rex's back. "No, they reminded me who I am, strong, capable, unafraid. The HOA thought they could intimidate us, but all they did was push us closer together." Rex leaned against her side, and Shadow's tail brushed the grass. The two guardians, once seen as threats, had become symbols of loyalty and protection, not just for, but for the community that now understood the difference between fear and respect. As the first stars appeared in the sky, sat with James on the porch, the dogs stretched out at their feet. For the first time since they had moved to estates, there was peace. The HOA no longer loomed as a force of oppression, but stood as what it was always meant to be. A body that served the people, not controlled them. And though new challenges would always come, she also knew this. Her family was strong, her dogs were steadfast, and her place in the neighborhood was no longer questioned. The battle had ended not with shouting or violence, but with truth, resilience, and the unshakable bond between a woman, her family, and the loyal guardians who had stood by her side. Estates would never be the same again, and neither would the Carters. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and join us for the next mystery on HOA Hunter Stories.